Welcome to part 2 of the Requiem horrors. People seem to enjoy the last video, so I'll keep making these showcases of my art since I enjoy making them. So let's pick up right where we left off and go to the next horror, Craw, or Time. The idea for Craw was sort of an Atlas-like figure, like something straight out of Greek mythology. This primeval force that is just as tethered to its quarry as it is in command of it, like the force itself is still subject to its own influence in a way. I wanted it to have some giant mechanical timepiece, like clicking and whirring, with chimes and pistons moving in inscrutable ways. Animated, I imagined the various arms and chunks of machinery moving at like completely random intervals, like it looks like it's keeping track of something, but not any linear time. I tried to emulate something Orokin-ish, since I didn't want a marble-style device, so I imagine a lot of gold and brass. Again, these guys coming from a place pre-Murmur reveal. I also wanted it to be covered in sharp void slag, like the stuff void angels are made out of, though that was more from a gameplay mindset, as I thought it should look more clearly menacing as a weapon, but we'll get to that in a moment. The Titan itself, I wanted to have multiple arms, as I was kind of thinking like arms on a clock, and one arm connected to the wheel itself by being impaled by it. Again, going back to that whole, the embodiment of the force is shackled to its power angle. Pretentious, I know. As for the head, I admittedly wasn't really thinking about the time theme at first, but more so I just wanted it to be abstract and clearly unnatural. I could easily come up with something like, oh, the raw, shapeless form of its head is the beginning of things, not yet shaped or eroded by time, or something, but weird and clearly not a head was the primary motivator. The runes on it, though, were a bit more thematically inspired, like it carries the void tongue upon itself, something that exists outside of time and yet binds its concept into a form, kind of inspired by traditional golems in like Jewish mythology. I think the design of Craw would be really elevated by sound and animation, though. I imagine it shuffling along, pulling itself by the wheel and dragging its gnarled, overgrown foot behind itself, and the most important feature is that it would be at a significantly lower simulated frame rate than everything else. Sometimes in games to save on memory, enemies past a certain distance will have their animation frames really cut down, and I was inspired by that idea. Not sure how feasible it would be, but maybe each off arm would also run at a different simulated frame rate as well, like Craw itself moving at the choppy speed, one arm moving at normal speed, and the third arm moving at like a hyper Dead Space Twitcher or Jacob's Ladder speed. Might not look too cohesive, but just an idea. Gameplay-wise, Craw would lash out with its wheel and even like rev it up and charge forward as it spun it up for its attacks. Its off arms would cast ranged attacks of some kind, weaving void sigils in the air, and both of the off arms could be disabled to limit its offense. However, its main gameplay purpose would be imposing a pretty brutal time limit on players. I imagine only a single Craw would be around at a time, but while it was active, it would put a doom clock on players that would increase each time it engaged the main lever on its wheel at regular intervals, signaling what was happening with booming bell tolls that ring across the map. Maybe if the entire body alternated between those various speeds I mentioned, it would look more cohesive, like increasing in simulated frame rate as the doom counter increased, so starting slow and choppy and then eventually the whole body elevating to that hyper twitcher movement. If players couldn't defeat it in time, it would just instantly kill them. No going down, no damage mitigation, nothing. Just dead. I imagine a lot of players probably wouldn't like that, but I think Warframe needs more threats to players that can't just be face tanked, and compared to a sudden one-shot, I think a fairly drawn-out death timer with clear, flags letting you know what was happening would be a pretty fair chance and give players some more agency and force them to shift focus a bit instead of, anchoring in one spot. Plus, I've always had a soft spot for doom timers in games. Anyway, on to Netra, or Decay. Netra I struggled with a lot. I wanted these designs in general to be a bit less overt body horror and more abstract horror, but Netra, being Decay, really stumped me on how I could evoke its theme without going full gross out mode. Initial ideas were way too grotesque, things like a splayed out rib cage and spinal column trailing flayed skin behind itself as wings, and the emptied husk of the body crawling around on all fours. Way too over the top stuff. I eventually decided to reframe the idea of decay as like the decay of reality, of the borders between things, the grand dissolution of everything into one thing. And thus we came to a big shuffling blob of melted together forms. Still pretty body horror-y, but I imagine the marble and stone textures could probably soften the grotesqueness a bit if it was fully realized. Trying to stick away from the corpse angle of decay, I went for a more plant-inspired angle, so I was trying to kind of evoke a tree formed of limbs with roots made of legs. I think I was still too shackled by traditional body horror to really realize what I was going for, but that was the direction I was trying to move. In gameplay, I imagine Netra slowly shuffling around with not much in the way of direct attacks. Instead, it would be extremely durable and spew a slowly spreading cloud of damage that would inflict guaranteed toxin, viral, and corrosive when touched. Each glowing orifice would be an obvious crit spot to mitigate some of that tankiness, again kind of taking notes from how I imagine Jahu would work. I basically imagine Netra as a sort of pressure point, trying to force players out of position as it slowly gets stronger. Players could stay in the zone or work around it while it's small, but the longer it's left alive, the more dangerous it becomes. You might notice a trend with the kind of enemies I want to see more of in Warframe. As the zone expands, the tree in the center would grow, and blackish roots would emerge from the orifices and twist into something resembling wings or a canopy, showing a clear visual on how dangerous a particular Netra embodiment is. Sound-wise, I actually imagine Netra to be very quiet, sounding like the wind through trees or rain, a soft, washing sound that gets louder as it gets more powerful, until it becomes a constant roaring of water. Overall, I don't hate the design, but I am a bit sad I wasn't quite able to push it in the right direction as far as I wanted. Next up is Foss, or Chaos. The idea behind Foss was something human stretched into animalistic shape, like the natural order had been broken and reason was reduced to a parody. With that in mind, I let myself go a bit more body horror than the other designs. For all these designs, I use the Requiem poems as a sort of jumping off point, and I think with Foss, it's the most apparent. I like the idea of something that's howling and moaning as it moves, but with each face clearly smiling from beneath loose folds of plaster skin, irreverently placed limbs and digits wriggling without any meaning, clawing at itself, at nothing. The extra parts, faces, etc. were all meant to feel random and, well, chaotic, less like many things melded together like Netra, but more like something had been made of too many things from its inception. From the beginning, I wanted the idea of like a human stretched into horse proportions, thought that sounded creepy, and then everything kind of fell into place from there. Key to the design, and something that comes hand in hand with its gameplay, is that it doesn't actually look too threatening, like it looks and sounds sick or hurt almost. Really wrinkly, hunched over, moaning, and so on. But, like the smiling faces indicate, and with how it would work in gameplay, 'tis but a clever ruse. In gameplay, I imagine Foss as a pure ambush predator, so from that idea alone, it probably wouldn't be too effective in Warframe, but let's just play out the rest of the idea. It would be signaled by a fairly low but distinct audio cue of its animalistic cries. From there, it would slowly circle around the conflict, staying at a far distance, but present. To facilitate that, it would walk unimpeded by walls, almost like it was orbiting its chosen prey and not working through the area, flitting back and forth between seen and unseen. It could be shot while stalking, but would quickly sprint into a wall or dive into the floor before it takes too much damage. Then, after a short period of stalking, it would let loose a really, really horrible sound, like wildcat screams ran through too many audio filters, and strike. It would charge extremely fast in a direct line at its prey, and if not damaged enough during its charge, would grab its chosen player and latch on. From there, it would drop its facade and stand on its hind legs, extending to almost twice its size when hunched over. Its bunched-up neck would telescope outwards like a snake, and it would unhinge its jaws and bite down. It would then do a lot of damage, but not a guaranteed instant kill, and inflict heavy bleed and puncture procs, and most importantly, a guaranteed radiation proc. After that, it would detach and fall back to fighting while on its hind legs with a few basic melee attacks, but its primary purpose would be done. If staggered out of its charge, it would also change to this fighting on hind leg state. While I do think it would be fun begging teammates to save you in the brief seconds before it bites down, I don't think its gameplay function would work too well in Warframe. There's also the fact that its main interaction before attacking revolves around sound, and I know that tends to be bad practice to restrict player threat analysis to a single avenue in terms of accessibility. I think a mitigation for that would be right before it charges, the player it's targeting would have some sort of visible particle effect wash over them, giving them a chance to try and find Foss before it strikes. But that still doesn't solve the main problem, that its interaction is a bit out of place for Warframe. Visually, I like the design, and gameplay-wise, I admit I just wanted to fight the Stalkers from Dead Space again, because they're some of my favorite enemies of all time. Next is Oull, or Oull. I always knew that I wanted one of these Requiem horrors to just be the man in the wall, but I flip-flopped on if it would be Oull or Lohk a lot, before finally settling that Wally should be void. Oull went through a lot of designs, but the main idea was always roughly the same. A bunch of small things joining together to become a single big thing, which seemed pretty appropriate given the way Oull works as a Requiem mod, a sort of everything enemy. I really struggled with how I wanted the smaller portions to look initially, thinking like abstract shape-based humanoids, and then when Whispers in the Wall was revealed and they showed off the fragmented one, I really got thrown for a loop and scrapped my ideas again. So Oull is the only one of these that I really settled on after Whispers was revealed and developed around what they showed off in that first reveal. Because of all that weirdness, I think it makes more sense to talk about Oull's gameplay before I go over the design of this final form. Fair warning, this art accounts for only like half of the idea, so enjoy a lot of slow panning while I ramble. The idea was basically that smaller versions of those screaming faces in the skybox would detach and slam down into certain open zones or emerge from the walls or ceilings in closed-off areas. From there, tons of glowing skeletal figures, kind of like Zaku, would peel themselves off of the faces and tear chunks of stone with them as body parts, forming as these partially complete statues connected by glowing vascular structure. As more and more of the smaller swarmers tore themselves off, the large faces would crumble until eventually collapsing into a final pile of swarmers. They would then rush straight at nearby players with no real tactics and not really do much other than kind of whip their body parts around clumsily. However, when killed, the vascular mesh dissolves, and the pieces fall to the floor before being sucked into other nearby swarmers, making them more durable and more damaging. I think like 2 to 3 stages of competency of the swarmers would sell the idea that they're evolving as they pick up more parts. Once enough swarmers had coalesced, they would all unite into the actual threat in the form of the mini-boss, and that's where the visuals from Oull come from. A big collection of smaller cast-off fragments reunited into a final form. From here, the idea I originally had in my head was, what if Horror-Ified really hated you, but also wanted to style on you as hard as possible? So the idea is grapples, kicks, backhand slaps, basically a really cocky and aggressive martial arts moveset that felt disrespectful as hell. But then when I settled on the visuals, that idea seemed a bit too silly. I think a fast, rush-down, melee-focused mini-boss would still function, though. I imagine the orbiting loose hands would be its ranged attacks, or augment its melee strikes, coming down as a swarm from afar, or with several of them forming into fists and coming in for follow-ups after each big main hand strike. At this point, I was also kind of thinking on the whole Janus angle. When I was designing the head, I went through a lot of ideas, including stuff that was closer to the Graven Mass from Elden Ring, but eventually wanted to go a bit more orthodox. I thought it would be neat if, going with that Yanis thing, the body could split at the sides and become almost like a quadruped, facing forward and back at the same time. Imagine the body peeling itself in two, like along where the heels connect, and then falling into almost a double wall sit position, supporting each other's back, and then scuttling around like that. But I'll stop there. Lots of messy ideas for Oull, and ultimately a pretty confused design. I do think it looks cool, though, and drawing all those goddamn feet and hands was good practice at least. And last is, of course, Lohk. Like I said, I knew I wanted the grand finale to be Wally, so here he is facing down the scholar from my little light novel. Nothing to really discuss here, though I am genuinely impressed at how decent I did on the foreshortening on his arms. I think I had like an artistic critical hit on that because I cannot do foreshortening that good normally. I also think I did okay on the line weighting, which is also something I tend to struggle with pushing really hard, so overall I'm happy with how the art turned out. And that is it for the Requiem horrors. Here's a rough size comparison I made for them a while back. Oull is a bit iffy since I kept messing with the design and gameplay idea, but the rest are pretty to scale with what I had in mind. I hope you enjoyed listening to my nonsense, and for those of you who went and read my dorky fanfiction, I hope you enjoyed that as well. I may be done with the Requiem horrors, but I do have other art, so I'll probably keep doing these little showcases since they're pretty fun, and I know not everyone who watches my videos keeps track of stuff outside of YouTube. If you'd like to see what I'm up to outside of YouTube videos, though, I show off my work-in-progress pieces on Patreon and YouTube memberships, and I'm even offering quick rough sketches as a perk for the $10 tiers. I've also linked my other socials in the description, so come hang out on Discord or pitch some ideas for my daily sketch prompts on Twitter if you're into that. But aside from all the shilling business, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good one.